What would you do if someone walked up to you in your own classroom and said, "You don't belong here"? Have you ever stepped into a room where every pair of eyes seemed to judge whether you deserved to be there? Where the silence felt heavier than words, and you could sense people deciding your worth before you even spoke? In 2010, in Selma, Alabama, the same city where people bled for the simple right to vote, a teenager named Aaliyah Coleman discovered that some battles never truly end. They just move from bridges to hallways, from voting booths to classrooms, from one generation's fight to the next. What she did next would prove that sometimes the biggest revolutions don't happen on famous bridges or in history books. Sometimes they happen in the most ordinary places, by the most extraordinary people who simply refuse to accept someone else's definition of where they belong. If you ever felt like an outsider fighting to prove you belong, hit that like button right now. Because Aaliyah's story might just change how you see your own battles. This isn't just another story about high school drama. This isn't even just another story about racism in the South. This is about what happens when a 16-year-old girl looks hatred in the face and decides that her dreams matter more than their comfort. This is about what courage looks like when it wears a backpack and carries textbooks instead of protest signs. The Edmund Pettus Bridge still stands in Selma today. Tourists walk across it, taking photos, remembering March 7th, 1965, the day that became known as Bloody Sunday. They remember John Lewis and the 600 marchers who faced down state troopers with nothing but determination and the belief that they deserved basic human rights. But here's what those tourists don't see. Here's what the history books don't tell you. The fight didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. It didn't end when laws changed on paper. It simply transformed, became quieter, more subtle, but no less real. 45 years after Bloody Sunday, Aaliyah Coleman would learn that lesson in the most personal way possible, not from a history textbook, but from the lips of classmates who looked at her brown skin and decided she didn't earn her seat in advanced placement classes, from teachers who stayed silent when insults flew across their classrooms, from a school system that had technically integrated but never truly welcomed. Born to Reggie Coleman, a mail carrier who'd worked the same route for 15 years, and Denise Coleman, a nursing assistant who pulled double shifts to make ends meet, Aaliyah grew up in a house where education wasn't just encouraged, it was treated like salvation itself. Their modest home on Selma's west side buzzed with gospel music on Sunday mornings, family photographs covering every surface, and the sound of weekend laughter when cousins came to visit. The Coleman family didn't have much, but they had something more valuable than money, an unshakable belief that knowledge could break any chain, open any door, cross any bridge. From the time she could hold a pencil, Aaliyah was different. While other kids played tag in the yard, she curled up in corners with novels twice her reading level. While her classmates complained about homework, she wrote essays that left teachers speechless. Not because they were good for a black girl, but because they were exceptional, period. Her dream was crystal clear. Earn a scholarship to college, become a teacher, and return to Selma to lift up the next generation. Her parents supported that dream with every overtime shift, every sacrifice weekend, every dollar saved in mason jars hidden around the house. They believed, truly believed, that education was a pathway through and beyond the barriers that had constrained their parents and grandparents. They believed that if their daughter was smart enough, worked hard enough, achieved enough, she would find acceptance in places they had been denied. They believed that merit would matter more than melanin. They were about to learn how wrong they were. By the time Aaliyah entered 9th grade at Morgan High School, the building had become a battleground of clashing identities wrapped in the veneer of integration. On paper, the school was diverse. In reality, invisible lines divided every hallway, every classroom, every lunch table. Wealthy white students, many from families with deep political connections, dominated honors classes like they owned them. They held student government positions like inherited titles. They played tennis and ran for homecoming court, as if these activities came with their birth certificates. Meanwhile, black students found themselves guided toward lower-level classes, offered fewer opportunities for leadership, invited to fewer after-school activities. It wasn't written policy. It was cultural DNA, passed down through decades of that's just how things are. It was a system designed to make Aaliyah Coleman feel like a visitor in her own education. And every single day, that system whispered the same message. You do not belong here in the way they do. What Aaliyah didn't know, as she walked through those doors for the first time, was that someone was about to say those words out loud. Someone was about to look her in the eye and tell her exactly what that system had been whispering all along. And when that moment came, everything would change. The Coleman family breakfast table told their story better than any biography ever could. Every morning at 6:30 a.m. sharp, Reggie Coleman sat with his coffee and Postal Service uniform pressed to perfection, while Denise rushed between packing lunch boxes and checking homework assignments before her shift at Selma Community Hospital. Their conversations weren't about the latest TV shows or weekend plans. They were about Aaliyah's grades, her reading progress, her plans for the future. Education wasn't just discussed in the Coleman household. It was worshipped like a religion, treated like the most precious inheritance parents could leave their child. Baby girl, your mind is your ticket out, Denise would say, adjusting Aaliyah's backpack straps each morning. Nobody can take your knowledge away from you. Nobody can argue with your excellence. Reggie would nod, adding his favorite phrase, work twice as hard to get half as much respect. But once you get it, you keep it. These weren't just motivational speeches. They were survival strategies passed down from grandparents who had lived through Jim Crow, from parents who had watched opportunities slip through their fingers, because doors remained locked no matter how hard they knocked. For Aaliyah, books became best friends. While her neighbors played basketball in driveways and gossiped about boys, she disappeared into libraries, devouring everything from Maya Angelou to Shakespeare. She wrote poetry in margins, crafted short stories during lunch breaks, and turned in book reports that teachers read twice, sometimes 3 times, because they couldn't believe a 13-year-old had written them. Her bedroom walls were covered with college brochures and acceptance letters she collected from university websites. Harvard, Howard, Spelman, Yale. She researched scholarship requirements like other kids studied video game cheat codes. By 8th grade, she had mapped out her entire academic future. Straight A's through high school, scholarship to a prestigious university, education degree, and back to Selma to change the system from within. Her parents believed this plan would work because they had to believe it. Because if education couldn't save their daughter from the barriers they had faced, then what could? Morgan High School seemed like the perfect place to prove their theory. The building itself was impressive. Modern classrooms, updated technology, a library that actually had books published after 1990. The student handbook promised excellence for all students and boasted about their diverse learning environment. What the handbook didn't mention was the invisible architecture that governed daily life inside those walls. Morgan High operated on an unspoken caste system more rigid than any official policy. It wasn't written down anywhere, never discussed in faculty meetings, never acknowledged in parent conferences. But every student understood the rules within their first week. The top tier belonged to wealthy white families. The Ashfords, the Hendersons, the Mitchells, whose names appeared on school board minutes and country club membership lists. Their children inherited honors classes, like family heirlooms. They ran for student government positions without campaigns because everyone already knew they would win. They played tennis and golf, sports that required expensive equipment and private lessons their parents could afford. These students moved through hallways with the confidence of ownership. Teachers remembered their older siblings fondly. Guidance counselors automatically enrolled them in college prep tracks. When they spoke in class, adults listened with the kind of attention reserved for future leaders. The middle tier was occupied by working-class white students and a handful of middle-class black families. These kids could access some honors classes if they fought for placement, join certain clubs if they persisted, participate in activities like basketball and track, sports that required talent more than money. At the bottom were students from Selma's West Side, the neighborhoods where the Coleman family lived. These kids were steered toward vocational tracks, encouraged to think about practical careers, invited to join clubs focused on community service rather than leadership development. Their voices were tolerated in classrooms but rarely celebrated. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, meant well when she pulled Aaliyah aside during freshman orientation. "Honey, I see you're interested in taking honors classes," she said, flipping through Aaliyah's middle school transcripts. "Now, I want you to be realistic about your goals. Maybe start with 1 or 2 advanced courses and see how you handle the workload. We don't want you to get overwhelmed. Aaliyah had perfect grades. She scored in the 98th percentile on standardized tests. She read at a college level and wrote essays that impressed English teachers with 20 years of experience. But Mrs. Patterson saw a black girl from the West Side and automatically assumed she needed to aim lower. The lunchroom geography revealed Morgan High's social DNA most clearly. White students claimed tables near the windows, where natural light made their conversation seem more important. Black students gathered near the back corner, where their laughter was contained, their discussions less likely to disturb others. If Aaliyah tried to sit at a mixed table, conversations would slow to awkward pauses. If she joined study groups in the library, she often found herself assigned note-taking duties while others handled real research. When teachers formed groups or projects, she frequently ended up in the leftover cluster. Students nobody else wanted to work with. None of this was overtly hostile. Nobody used slurs or openly declared her inferior. The racism at Morgan High was more sophisticated than that, wrapped in smiles and coded with phrases like, "I didn't see you there," or "Are you sure you're in the right class?" But Aaliyah felt every slight, cataloged every microaggression, carried every dismissive comment home in her backpack like stones. She tried to talk to her parents about it, but how do you explain that nobody calls you names, yet everyone treats you like you're invisible? How do you describe the weight of constantly proving you deserve to occupy the same spaces as your white classmates? "Just keep your grades up, baby," her mother would say. "Excellence speaks louder than ignorance." Her father would add, "Show them what Coleman excellence looks like." So Aaliyah doubled down on her studies, convinced that perfect test scores could silence doubts about her belonging. She signed up for every advanced class available, joined academic clubs, volunteered for extra credit projects. She was about to learn that some people would question her right to belong no matter how excellent she became, and one of them was about to say it to her face. October 15, 2010, Aaliyah would remember that date for the rest of her life. Not because anything historically significant happened to the world that day, but because it was a day someone looked her directly in the eyes and spoke the words that had been whispered about her in hallways for months. She had fought to get into advanced placement U.S. history. Not just applied, fought. When Mrs. Patterson initially refused to sign her enrollment form, citing concerns about the rigorous workload, Aaliyah brought her mother to school for a conference that lasted 2 hours and ended with Denise Coleman's voice rising just enough to remind everyone in the room that her daughter had never earned anything lower than an A- in her entire academic career. "She belongs in that classroom," Denise had said, her nursing uniform still wrinkled from her overnight shift, and she's going to prove it. The approval came through 3 days later. Walking into Mr. Harlan's classroom that first morning felt like stepping across an invisible threshold. The room itself was beautiful. Tall windows overlooking the school courtyard, walls lined with portraits of American presidents, bookshelves filled with thick volumes about constitutional law and civil rights movements. But it was the faces that told the real story. 24 students sat in perfectly arranged desks. 23 of them were white. Most came from families Aaliyah recognized from local newspaper photos, parents who served on city council, owned successful businesses, belonged to country clubs her family could never afford to join. As she walked through the door, conversations didn't just pause, they stopped completely. 23 heads turned in her direction with the kind of synchronized movement you see in horror movies when a monster appears. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsed it in her bedroom mirror, practiced walking confidently while her heart hammered against her ribcage. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a navy blue sweater her mother bought specifically for this class, khaki pants without a single wrinkle, her favorite silver earrings that caught light when she moved her head. She looked professional, prepared, determined. None of that mattered to the boys sitting in the third row. Travis Mitchell was Morgan High royalty. His father owned the largest construction company in Dallas County. His mother served on a hospital board alongside Selma's most prominent families. Travis himself was starting quarterback on the football team, already committed to Auburn University on a full athletic scholarship. He was also the kind of person who had never been told no in his 17 years of life. As Aaliyah made her way toward an empty desk in the middle of the room, Travis leaned back in his chair just enough to catch her eye. His voice was casual, conversational, like he was commenting on the weather or asking about weekend plans. "You don't belong here." For words, delivered with a kind of matter-of-fact confidence reserved for people who had never questioned their own right to occupy any space they chose. The reaction was immediate. A few students smirked. Others looked away quickly, suddenly fascinated by their notebooks or the view outside those tall windows. One girl, Madison Ashford, whose family had lived in Selma for 5 generations, actually giggled behind her hand. But it was Mr. Harlan's reaction that cut deepest. He said nothing. Richard Harlan had been teaching high school history for 12 years. He held a master's degree from the University of Alabama. He had written lesson plans about the civil rights movement, assigned papers about Rosa Parks and Dr. King, led discussions about the importance of equality and justice in American society. And when one of his students looked at the only black girl in his classroom and told her she didn't belong there, he pretended he didn't hear it. His silence wasn't neutral. It was permission. Aaliyah felt heat rise in her cheeks, spreading across her face like a fever. Her hands began to shake, barely noticeable, but enough that she had to grip her backpack straps to steady herself. The room suddenly felt smaller, airless, like the walls were closing in around her. She wanted to respond. She wanted to stand up and remind Travis that she had earned her place in this classroom with perfect grades and standardized test scores that ranked in the top 5% statewide. She wanted to tell him that her great-grandfather had been born into slavery but fought his way to literacy, that her grandmother had cleaned white families' houses to pay for her children's education, that her parents worked double shifts so she could dream bigger than anyone in her family ever had. Instead, she sat down in silence. Because what do you say when someone questions your right to exist in a space you've earned? What words could possibly respond to the casual cruelty of someone who looks at your melanin and decides your merit doesn't matter? The class proceeded as if nothing had happened. Mr. Harlan launched into his syllabus presentation, discussing reading assignments and essay requirements and examination schedules. Other students took notes, asked questions about grading policies, laughed at his attempted jokes about historical figures. Aaliyah heard none of it. Those 4 words, "You don't belong here," echoed in her mind like a mantra, drowning out everything else. She stared at her blank notebook page, pen frozen in her hand, while Travis's voice replayed on an endless loop. "You don't belong here. You don't belong here. You don't belong here." When the bell rang 50 minutes later, students gathered their books and filed toward the door in clusters of conversation about upcoming football games and weekend parties. Travis walked past Aaliyah's desk without a glance, already moving on to his next class, his next conversation, his next day of never questioning whether he deserved to be anywhere he chose to go. But for Aaliyah, something fundamental had shifted. She had spent her entire academic career believing that excellence would protect her from prejudice. She had trusted her parents' advice that hard work could overcome any barrier, that merit would always triumph over bias. She had been wrong. As she gathered her books and prepared to face the rest of her day, a new understanding settled in her chest like a stone. This wasn't going to be about proving she was smart enough to belong in advanced classes. This was going to be about proving she was strong enough to stay there when people like Travis Mitchell reminded her daily that her presence made them uncomfortable. Comment below. Have you ever had someone question your right to be in a space you earned? Because what Aaliyah did next proves that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to leave. Walking toward her next class, Aaliyah made a decision that would define the rest of her high school career. If they wanted to make her feel like an intruder in her own education, she would become the most persistent intruder they had ever encountered. She was about to learn that belonging isn't something other people give you. It's something you take. By junior year, Aaliyah had learned to armor herself with achievements. She carried a 4.0 GPA like a shield. She served as vice president of the Student Literary Club, tutored freshmen struggling with algebra, and volunteered at Selma Community Hospital every Saturday morning. Her AP test scores ranked among the top 5 in her class. Her essay on voting rights in modern America had been selected for the state academic competition. On paper, she was everything Morgan High School claimed to celebrate, a dedicated student leader with excellent grades and community involvement. In reality, she remained an outsider looking in. The daily microaggressions had become routine. Group projects where her ideas were politely dismissed before being repeated by white classmates and suddenly deemed brilliant. Study sessions where she was invited as an afterthought, only to arrive and find the real planning had happened elsewhere. Teachers who praised her work with surprised expressions, as if excellence from a black student was somehow unexpected. But Aaliyah had developed strategies. She documented everything, every dismissive comment, every bypass opportunity, every moment when her contributions were minimized. She spoke up more forcefully in class discussions, refusing to let her voice be drowned out. She applied for leadership positions others assumed she wouldn't want. She was tired of being invisible. That's why she decided to run for student body treasurer. The position wasn't glamorous, managing budgets for school events, tracking fundraising efforts, coordinating with local businesses for sponsorship deals. But it was real leadership, with actual influence over school decisions and a platform to advocate for changes she believed Morgan High desperately needed. Her parents were thrilled. "Now they'll have to listen to you," Denise said, helping Aaliyah design campaign posters at their kitchen table. "They'll have to respect what you bring to the table." Reggie nodded, adding his usual wisdom. "Excellence speaks for itself, baby girl. And you got more excellence than all of them combined." The Coleman family spent an entire weekend creating Aaliyah's campaign materials. They chose a photo where she wore her favorite burgundy blazer, her smile confident but approachable. The slogan took hours to perfect. "For fairness, for all, vote Aaliyah Coleman." Simple, clear, inclusive. On Monday morning, Aaliyah arrived at school early to hang posters throughout the hallways. She positioned them strategically, near the main entrance where students couldn't miss them, outside the cafeteria where lunch crowds would see them, by the library where academic-minded students gathered. Each poster represented hope. Hope that her classmates would judge her on merit rather than melanin. Hope that her track record of service and achievement would matter more than their preconceptions. Hope that Morgan High was ready for a different kind of student leader. For exactly 24 hours, that hope felt justified. Students she barely knew stopped her in hallways to say they planned to vote for her. Teachers mentioned seeing her campaign materials and commented on her qualifications. Even some white students from her AP classes seemed genuinely supportive, discussing her platforms for better mental health resources and more diverse extracurricular opportunities. Then Tuesday morning arrived. Aaliyah discovered the vandalism on her way to first period. Someone had taken a black marker, the choice of color felt deliberate, and scrawled across her poster near the main entrance, "Not our kind. Go back where you belong." The words hit like physical blows, not just because of their cruelty, but because of their historical weight. "Not our kind," and "go back where you belong" were phrases her grandparents had heard in different contexts. Lunch counters they weren't allowed to approach, neighborhoods they weren't welcome to enter, jobs they weren't qualified to hold regardless of their skills. Now those same words were being weaponized against their granddaughter for daring to seek student government office at an integrated high school in 2012. But the vandalism was just the beginning. By lunchtime, 3 more posters had been torn down completely. Someone had crossed out her name on 2 others, writing "O" in large red letters. The poster outside the library had been defaced with a crude drawing and language so offensive that Mrs. Henderson, the librarian, removed it before most students could see it. Aaliyah felt the familiar heat rising in her cheeks, the same sensation she'd experienced that first day in Mr. Harlan's classroom when Travis Mitchell had questioned her belonging. But this time, the attack wasn't coming from one person. This was coordinated, systematic, designed to send a clear message to her and anyone else who might be watching. The message was unmistakable. Know your place. That afternoon, she sat in her car in the school parking lot, staring at the remaining campaign flyers on her passenger seat. Her hands trembled slightly as she considered her options. She could withdraw from the race, claim she was too busy with academic responsibilities to serve in student government. She could focus on her studies and college applications, avoid the controversy entirely. It would be easier, safer, more comfortable for everyone involved. She almost did it. almost convinced herself that student government wasn't worth this level of hostility, almost decided that keeping her head down and maintaining her grades was the wiser path forward, almost let other people's hatred determine the boundaries of her ambition. But then she remembered her mother's voice from the previous weekend. They'll have to respect what you bring to the table. She thought about her grandmother's stories of cleaning houses for families who treated her like she was invisible, who paid her less than minimum wage because they could, who never bothered to learn her name despite employing her for years. She thought about every student at Morgan High who looked like her, who watched this election unfold, who would learn from her response whether it was worth fighting for spaces they deserved to occupy. And she remembered something her mother had told her years earlier during one of their kitchen table conversations about overcoming obstacles. Baby, every time they tell you where you don't belong, it's proof you're already there. You're breaking walls they thought would stand forever. That evening, Aaliyah printed new posters. Not because she was naive about the challenges ahead. Not because she expected the harassment to stop. But because withdrawal would send the wrong message to every black student at Morgan High who was watching, wondering if excellence and determination could overcome prejudice. She was about to prove that sometimes they could. The next morning, she arrived at school even earlier than before, hanging fresh campaign materials in every location where previous ones had been destroyed. But this time, she had help. Marcus Johnson, a sophomore she had tutored in algebra, showed up with tape and scissors. Keisha Washington, a senior from her literary club, brought extra markers for touch-ups. Word had spread through Morgan High's black student population. They had watched the vandalism, witnessed the attempts to silence Aaliyah's campaign, and decided they weren't going to stand by quietly. This wasn't just about student government anymore. This was about whether talented, qualified students could seek leadership roles without facing coordinated campaigns of intimidation. If you believe that persistence beats prejudice, smash that subscribe button, because Aaliyah's fight is about to teach us all what real courage looks like. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood those who believed Morgan High's leadership positions belonged to certain types of students from certain types of families. On the other stood a 17-year-old girl with a 4.0 GPA and the audacity to believe her merit mattered more than their comfort. Election day was still 2 weeks away, but the real contest had already begun, and Aaliyah Coleman was just getting started. Aaliyah lost the election by 37 votes. The margin was closer than anyone expected, close enough to prove that her campaign had resonated with more students than the vandals had anticipated, close enough to show that Morgan High was changing, even if slowly, close enough to terrify those who preferred the old order. But losing still hurt. Election night, she sat in her bedroom surrounded by leftover campaign materials, staring at vote tallies that represented 2 weeks of harassment, destroyed posters, and anonymous threats slipped into her locker. Her parents tried to comfort her, offering ice cream and reminders about moral victories. But Aaliyah felt the weight of every "not our kind" scrawled across her image. She had given everything to that campaign, her time, her energy, her hope, and it hadn't been enough. Or so she thought. Within a week, something unexpected began happening. Freshmen approached her in hallways, thanking her for running, saying they planned to seek leadership positions because she had shown them it was possible. Sophomores joined clubs they had previously considered not for people like them. Even some juniors started speaking up more forcefully in class discussions, refusing to let their voices be marginalized. Her campaign had lost, but her courage had won something more valuable. It had given other students permission to dream bigger. "You open doors, baby girl," her mother said during one of their kitchen table conversations. Sometimes that matters more than walking through them yourself. Senior year brought validation Aaliyah had never dared hope for. Her SAT scores ranked in the 99th percentile nationally, not just among students from Alabama or the South, but nationwide. Her AP test results earned college credit at universities across the country. Her essay about voting rights and modern democracy was selected for publication in a state academic journal. Most importantly, college acceptances started arriving. Howard University, Spelman College, Emory University. Each acceptance letter came with scholarship offers that would cover full tuition, room, and board. Her grades, test scores, extracurricular leadership, and community service had created a profile that elite universities competed to attract. The same excellence that some classmates had questioned now opened doors to opportunities they could only dream about accessing. In March of her senior year, Morgan High School invited Aaliyah to deliver a speech at their annual Academic Excellence Assembly, a ceremony honoring students with the highest GPAs, most impressive test scores, and strongest college acceptance records. The irony wasn't lost on her. The school that had allowed classmates to question her belonging now wanted to showcase her achievements to parents, community members, and local media attending the ceremony. She almost declined. "Why should I represent a school that never fully accepted me?" she asked her parents during dinner. "Why should I stand up there and pretend everything was fine when it wasn't?" Her father set down his fork, considering his words carefully. "Maybe because refusing to speak will let them off the hook," he said. "Maybe because you've earned the right to tell your truth in front of everyone who needs to hear it." Her mother nodded. "You've got something to say, and now you've got the platform to say it. Don't waste that opportunity." So Aaliyah wrote a speech, not the sanitized, feel-good speech the administration expected, not the generic motivational message about hard work and perseverance that most students delivered at such events. She wrote the speech she wished someone had given when she first walked into Morgan High School, honest, unflinching, and unapologetically direct. The night before the assembly, she practiced in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her tone, refining her phrasing, preparing for whatever reaction her words might generate. April 15, 2013. Exactly 2.5 years after Travis Mitchell had told her she didn't belong in Mr. Harlan's classroom. The auditorium was packed. Parents filled every seat. Teachers lined the walls, and students occupied the balcony section, reserved for the student body. Local newspaper reporters sat in the front row, cameras ready to capture another feel-good story about academic achievement in rural Alabama. Aaliyah walked across the stage wearing her burgundy blazer, the same one from her campaign photos, and stepped behind the podium. Looking out to sea of faces, she saw the full spectrum of Morgan High's population: supportive teachers who had advocated for her, classmates who had vandalized her posters, parents who had raised children to question her belonging, and younger students who were watching to see what courage looked like in real time. The auditorium fell silent. She had prepared opening remarks about gratitude and school spirit. But standing there in that moment, she decided to skip the pleasantries and speak the truth instead. "When my grandmother was my age, she wasn't allowed to vote," Aaliyah began, her voice clear and steady. "When my parents were young, they were told to sit at the back of the bus. And when I came into this very building 3 years ago, some of you told me I didn't belong here." A murmur swept through the audience. Parents exchanged glances. Students shifted in their seats. This wasn't the speech they had expected. "But I want you to know I do belong here. And so does every student who refuses to let ignorance dictate their destiny." She paused, letting those words settle before continuing. "I belong here because I earned a 4.0 GPA while some of you questioned whether I was smart enough for honors classes. I belong here because I scored in the 99th percentile on standardized tests, while others suggested I aim for more realistic goals. I belong here because I've been accepted to universities that some of you will never see, with scholarships that recognize excellence regardless of zip code or melanin." The silence in the auditorium was absolute now. No coughing, no shuffling, no whispered conversations. 800 people listening to an 18-year-old girl speak truth to power with the kind of eloquence that comes from years of fighting for recognition. Some of you tried to tear down my campaign posters. Some of you wrote messages telling me to go back where I belong. Well, I want to be clear about something. I belong wherever my intelligence, my character, and my determination can take me. That includes your honors classes, your student government, your universities, and any other space I choose to occupy. She looked directly at the section where she could see Travis Mitchell sitting with his parents, his face flushed red. And for every student in this auditorium who has ever been told they don't belong somewhere, whether because of their race, their economic status, their accent, or any other characteristic someone else decided disqualified them, I want you to know that their comfort with your presence is not a requirement for your success. The auditorium remained silent for several seconds after she finished speaking. Then Slowly, applause began from the back rows where younger students sat. It spread gradually through the balcony section, gained momentum as it reached the main floor, and eventually filled the entire space with the kind of sustained ovation reserved for moments when Smeon speaks a truth everyone needed to hear. Standing ovation, not just from black students or supported teachers, but from parents who had never considered their own complicity in maintaining barriers, from classmates who had witnessed years of microaggressions without speaking up, from community members who were hearing Morgan High's reality described honestly for the first time. In that moment, Aaliyah knew she had done more than deliver a speech. She had rewritten the narrative about who belonged at Morgan High School, and that narrative would outlast every student sitting in that auditorium. The video of Aaliyah's speech went viral before viral was common. Someone in the audience, later revealed to be Mrs. Henderson, the librarian who had removed offensive graffiti from Aaliyah's campaign posters, recorded the entire assembly on her phone and uploaded it to YouTube that same evening. Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed 50,000 times. Within a week, major news outlets were calling Morgan High School requesting interviews. Alabama student challenges school culture in powerful graduation speech read the headline in the Birmingham News. CNN featured a segment about Aaliyah during their education coverage. The video was shared across social media platforms with comments from viewers who recognized their own experiences in her words. But the real impact happened within Morgan High's walls. The week after her speech, Principal Matthews called an emergency faculty meeting to discuss creating more inclusive environments for all students. Teachers who had remained silent when witnessing microaggressions suddenly felt compelled to address discriminatory behavior in their classrooms. The Guidance Counseling Department instituted new policies requiring documented justification for steering students away from advanced courses. Most importantly, student culture began shifting in ways both subtle and significant. The following year, Morgan High elected its first black student body president, a sophomore named Marcus Johnson, who had helped Aaliyah hang replacement campaign posters during her treasurer race. In his victory speech, he thanked Aaliyah for showing him that leadership positions weren't reserved for certain types of students. 3 years later, the school's Academic Honor Society was led by a black student for the first time in its 40-year history. 5 years after Aaliyah's speech, Morgan High's student government was more diverse than it had ever been, with leadership positions held by students from various racial and economic backgrounds. Teachers began assigning her speech as required viewing in their American history classes, using it to discuss how civil rights struggles continued into the 21st century. Students wrote essays analyzing her message, often connecting her experiences to challenges they face in their own lives. The culture shift extended beyond student government. Academic tracking practices were reformed to ensure qualified students weren't discouraged from challenging courses based on demographic assumptions. The school implemented mentorship programs pairing older students with underclassmen who might otherwise feel isolated or unwelcome in certain spaces. Meanwhile, Aaliyah was building her own legacy at Howard University. She majored in education policy with a minor in political science, maintaining her characteristic excellence while expanding her understanding of systemic barriers in educational institutions. She served as president of the Pre-Law Society, edited the university's policy journal, and spent summers interning with organizations focused on educational equity. Her senior thesis, titled From Selma to Everywhere, How Local Courage Creates National Change, examined how individual acts of resistance in small communities influence broader social movements. She interviewed dozens of students who had challenged discriminatory practices in schools across the South, documenting patterns of resistance and institutional response. After graduation, Aaliyah was accepted into Harvard Law School with a full fellowship focused on education law. Her law school application essay, which detailed her experiences at Morgan High and connected them to broader questions about access and equity in public education, was later published in the Harvard Education Review as an example of how personal narrative can illuminate systemic issues. At Harvard, she specialized in civil rights law with a focus on educational discrimination cases. She worked with legal clinics representing students who faced barriers similar to those she had encountered, tracking practices that limited opportunities, disciplinary policies that disproportionately affected students of color, and informal cultures that made certain students feel unwelcome in advanced academic programs. Her law school professors recognized her unique combination of lived experience and analytical skills. She could speak about educational discrimination not just as legal theory, but as someone who had navigated these systems personally and emerged with strategies for reform. After earning her law degree, Aaliyah joined the Education Law Center, a nonprofit organization that challenges discriminatory practices in public schools across the country. Her first major case involved a high school in Mississippi where black students were systematically excluded from honors classes despite meeting all academic requirements, a situation remarkably similar to her own experiences at Morgan High. She won that case. The victory established her reputation as a formidable advocate for educational equity. Over the following years, she represented students in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Florida, challenging everything from biased disciplinary practices to inadequate funding for schools in predominantly black communities. Her work caught the attention of national media outlets and policy organizations. She testified before Congress about the ongoing need for federal oversight of educational discrimination. She consulted with school districts seeking to reform their practices proactively rather than waiting for legal challenges. In 2020, HBO produced a documentary titled The Speech: How One Student Changed Her School. The film featured interviews with Aaliyah, her former classmates, and Morgan High teachers, exploring how her courage had transformed not just her own trajectory, but the entire school culture. During filming, she returned to Morgan High for the first time since graduation. Walking through hallways where she had once felt like an intruder, she met with current students who knew her story and saw her as proof that persistence could overcome prejudice. "She showed us that we don't have to accept other people's limits on our dreams," said one senior who was preparing to attend college on an academic scholarship. "When people question whether we belong somewhere, we can prove them wrong just by staying and succeeding." The documentary won 3 Emmy Awards and sparked national conversations about how individual courage can create institutional change. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Travis Mitchell, the classmate who had first told her she didn't belong in their shared classroom, now a father of 2 daughters, he reached out through Facebook with a message that arrived on the 10th anniversary of her graduation speech. "I've been thinking about the person I was in high school and the words I said to you. I was wrong. My daughters are growing up in a better world partly because you refused to accept my ignorance. Thank you for not giving up." Aaliyah had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to "you don't belong here" is simply refusing to leave. And in doing so, she had changed what belonging looked like for everyone who came after her. Aaliyah Coleman's story isn't really about one girl in one high school in one Alabama town. It's about every person who has ever walked into a room and been made to feel like they didn't earn their seat at the table. It's about every student who was told to lower their expectations, every dreamer who was advised to be more realistic, every achiever who was questioned not because of their grades, but because of their appearance. It's about the quiet army of people who face microaggressions disguised as concern, who navigate systems designed to make them doubt their own worth, who carry the exhausting burden of proving their humanity one interaction at a time. But most importantly, it's about what happens when someone refuses to shrink. When Aaliyah chose to stay in that AP history classroom, despite being told she didn't belong, she wasn't just claiming her own education. She was holding the door open for every student who would come after her. When she ran for student government despite knowing she would face harassment, somewhere needs to hear it.